My name is Monet, and I'm your host of Winding Through Time, the podcast that travels through time to explore different people, places, and events while pairing these facts with wine. To learn what bicycles and the Buffalo Soldiers have in common, tune into this episode of Winding Through Time. Hello, and welcome back to Winding Through Time. I'm your host, Monet, and as usual, I am extremely happy to have you join me again for my newest episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I do not take it lightly that you are choosing to spend this day or evening with me. So let's jump into this newest episode. When I left off on my last episode, The Sweet Taste of Victory, I told you about my trip to the Buffalo Soldiers Museum and that I would be doing my next episode on the Buffalo Soldiers. Of course, the universe took me in a totally different direction than I initially thought that I would go, but I'm extremely excited about presenting this content to you this evening. So, as I toured this museum, one peculiar thing on exhibit I saw was a bicycle. And at the time, I was so excited about getting through and looking at the rest of the exhibit. I quickly snapped a picture of the bicycle and the plaque, and I thought I would, kind of read about it later, catch up. So I went through the exhibit, which is a wonderful museum. So if you're ever in Houston, Texas, definitely check it out. But got back home, haven't even honestly looked through all of the pictures yet. So it's going to be interesting to see what this plaque says and how it relates to what I'm going to talk about tonight. But I came across an article about a gentleman who was riding a bicycle in honor of the trek that the Buffalo Soldiers had taken many years, prior in honor of them. And I read this article and I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I really have to dig a little deeper and find out some more information about this. So I began doing my research and I thought this would be such a dope episode. So here we are now. So I'm going to tell you about this epic journey um, that the Buffalo Soldiers found themselves traveling along. And this group, they would complete a 1,900-mile journey. And they were at the time known because of this journey as the Iron Riders. Now, this journey is fascinating, not only because it was done on bicycles, but I think what made it even more interesting or fascinating was the fact that it was done by the Buffalo Soldiers. It's really just added another twist or element um, of fascination to this story. So, before I jump into the story, let me give you a little bit of background information about the Buffalo Soldiers because some people they may have never heard of the Buffalo Soldiers or only heard of the name, but they're really not familiar with the group. So, the Buffalo Soldiers were formed towards the latter part of the Civil War, and they were African Americans. Many of them were former slaves who the Army reluctantly allowed to enlist. They really didn't want them to enlist, but they reluctantly gave in and allowed them to. And in 1866, the legislation was adopted to create six all African American military regiments. Two of them would be cavalry units and four infantry regiments that were later consolidated into two, and that would be the 24th and the 25th Regiment. And these men would represent the first Black professional soldiers in a peacetime army. Now, these men were originally stationed in Louisiana, but some of the white citizens weren't too comfortable with Black soldiers, mostly Black men, carrying guns. So they were moved away, far, far away. And these soldiers were assigned out west to some of the hardest posts. Now, out west, they would act as pseudo Wild Wild West sheriffs. And they were responsible for keeping the peace by catching outlaws, subduing revolutions, and hostile Native Americans. Now, in addition to keeping the peace, they were also responsible for mapping the area and establishing new outposts for future towns. Now, you would think the locals would be appreciative of these men helping out, to instill and maintain the peace in their towns, but a lot of them weren't. And these soldiers still faced racism and sometimes hostility from the locals that whom they were protecting. The army actually wasn't much better, and these soldiers were only sent to some of the hardest areas, but they were also given like the worst equipment and the worst horses that the army had, just the worst of the worst. But this did not break their souls. This didn't deter the soldiers at all. They still performed the duties with honor and excellence, and this excellence didn't go unnoticed by one group, and that is how they got their name. So the nickname Buffalo Soldiers started with the Cheyenne warriors in the late 1860s. And the Cheyenne warriors respected the soldiers and they gave them the nickname out of respect for their fierce fighting ability. Now, the Cheyenne warriors also said the curly hair of the soldiers reminded them of the mane of a buffalo. So the nickname was given and would go on to eventually apply to all African American soldiers who served from the late 1860s to World War II. So, how did these soldiers go from being buffalo soldiers to iron riders? Well, Lieutenant James A. Moss will play a big part in that. Now, was he African American, you ask? Nope. And there's a reason he was selected for this particular assignment. So, Lieutenant James A. Moss, he was born in Lafayette, Louisiana, and he had the honor of attending West Point, but he ranked at the bottom of his class, so he was among the last to receive a post assignment. And a lot of the white officers did not want to serve with black soldiers or go out west. So, guess who received that particular assignment? Ta da! If you guessed Lieutenant James A. Moss, you are absolutely right. So, Lieutenant Moss would lead an all black infantry unit, and he would later write that he never commanded better men. Now, in addition to commanding soldiers, Lieutenant Moss was an avid cyclist, and he actually advocated for the incorporation of bicycles into the military. Lieutenant Moss couldn't make this happen on his own, so he enlisted the help of Lieutenant General Nelson Miles. Lieutenant General Nelson Miles was down for the cause, so he wrote the Secretary of War in support of this task. Now, you might wonder why Lieutenant General Nelson Miles was so willing to support. Well, it turns out he was also an advocate for military biking, and he admired the contributions of the 1st Signal Corps. Who were they? I have a little information on them as well. The 1st Signal Corps of Connecticut National Guard was the first American force to have a formal military bicycle unit, and they were primarily used to relay messages. So Lieutenant General Nelson Miles, he admired that, and he wrote to the Secretary of War to receive approval to authorize missions to test the effectiveness of the bicycle to see if they could also implement this on a wider scale in the Army. The approval was given, and this bicycling experiment was given a green light. In order to test the success of cycling as a form of transportation, the most rugged terrain was selected for this journey, and Lieutenant Moss began to seek donations for bicycles and equipment. Now, one of the companies to come to his rescue, or to assist rather, was A.G. Spalding and Brothers. Now, if you're in the biking world or you owned a bike in the 80s and the 90s like me, you've probably heard of Spalding bikes. A new military special was actually designed for this particular journey for Lieutenant Moss and his men. So, Lieutenant Moss, he would serve as first in command, and Lieutenant James M. Kennedy would serve as second in command. Now, this was so interesting to me. Lieutenant Kennedy, he was an assistant surgeon who was considered one of the best surgeons in the Army at the time. And he was born in South Carolina, and he was considered a typical Southern man. So you can imagine he was not thrilled at all about being tapped for this journey. He wasn't happy, but nevertheless, he was selected. He had his armies and his army orders, and here he was. Now, in addition to having Lieutenant Kennedy on board as a surgeon, because you definitely need some medical assistance, Lieutenant Moss understood the magnitude of this journey, and he wanted to to garner as much support as possible. He was so strategic about this. So he thought he would catch the attention of the American public. If he could do that, it would make the Army pay more attention to this experiment. And to get this attention, he brought along an actual reporter by the name of Edward Booz to ensure that this journey would be documented. Now, Edward Booz was a reporter for the Daily. Ooh, this is interesting. I'll pause for a second because I've heard this word and I'm looking at it again. Missoulian. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know somebody out there will. Bear with me. But he was a reporter for this newspaper, and he was really well respected in his field. Booth's articles appeared in newspapers across the country, so having him ride along would ensure nationwide coverage. It didn't hurt that Booth's dad was also the editor, a little hookup there. So you have your second in command, you have your reporter, and you have your troops. Who else was called up for this mission? None other than the Buffalo Soldiers, of course. So the men, they were extremely thrilled about embarking on this journey, and they would need all of that enthusiasm and more to complete this journey. So on June 14th, 1897, the 1,900-mile expedition from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri would begin. The men were expected to travel at least 50 miles a day, pedaling at least 55 pounds of supplies. The men would have to carry half a tent strapped to their handlebars. Now, inside of that tent was a blanket, underclothes, and a toothbrush. Now, you remember how some of us growing up, your parents or grandmother would tell you not to let anyone hold your comb? Well, that did not apply here because all 23 men would share only two combs. In addition to their personal items, they would also carry tools. Some tools were carried in containers made of metal that doubled as cooking supplies. So you can imagine the noise those tools rattling around in those metal containers would make. Would probably drive me crazy. So Lieutenant James Moss and Lieutenant James Kennedy would lead the following soldiers. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, Lance Corporal William J. Haynes, Corporal Abram Martin, musician Elias Johnson, Private Travis Bridges, Private Francis Button, Private John Cook, Private Hiram L.B. Dingman, Private John Findley, the mechanic, Private Elwood A. Foreman, Private Frank L. Johnson, Private Sam Johnson, Private Eugene Jones, Private William Proctor, Private Samuel Reed, Private George Scott, Private Richard Rout, Private Sam Williamson, Private William Williamson, Private John Wilson, and reporter Edward Booz. Now, there's a reason why I named all of these soldiers. Um, and you'll have to listen and wait until the end to hear exactly why. Now, this definitely had to be a sight to see. Three white men leading 20 black soldiers on bikes, rifles slung over their shoulders, backpacks on the backs of pristine uniforms, and bright white blankets tied to handlebars. Now, I'm quite sure you might have seen a wobble or two on those first few miles because only five of the soldiers were experienced riders. And actually, one had just learned how to ride a bike a little over a week before this journey. The men, they will follow the same route as the Northern Pacific Railroad to provide them with close proximity to the trains, and this would allow them to receive regular access to fresh supplies. Now, the soldiers, they started this journey and they were almost immediately met with horrible weather. Now, remember, the roads weren't paved, and many of them were very rugged and in bad condition. About 30 miles into this journey, the sky fell and the road quickly turned into what they described as gumbo. You can imagine that's mud. The soldiers were forced to push their bikes, stopping only to scrape off the thick mud with knives and sticks. The rain didn't let up until that evening, leaving those pristine uniforms and equipment soaked and dirty. The soldiers would push through rain and mud for the next 2 days before reaching their first supply station. And believe it or not, they weren't met with a cheering crowd, but they were met with a fresh blanket of snow. They finally made it to their first supply station, and after rest and restock, they continued their journey. I could just only imagine, you're soaking wet, mud, dirty, you come into snow. I can only imagine what was going through their brains, but they were strong men and they pressed on. Now, the next stretch of the journey did not include rain. However, the riders were forced to ride along broken train rails, which became physically painful for them, and it slowed down their journey significantly. After a week of riding through mud, rocks, snow, and raggedy tracks, their bikes needed to be checked out, and Private John Finley was the mechanic responsible for conducting those examinations. So, on this journey, whenever a bicycle had a problem, Finley would trade bicycles with the rider, allow them to continue. He would stay behind, fix the bicycle, and catch up with the rest of the group. I can only imagine. And being a black man in the wilderness, alone, fixing a bicycle. Nevertheless, the soldiers continued, and they continued to encounter difficulties throughout their journey. When the mud became too thick, they would carry the bicycles on their back. The men would sometimes wade through waist high water. They endured hail, dust storms, and fought through alkaline poisoning that they actually got from drinking contaminated water. The tight time frame that they were on allowed little to no extra time for rest, even during bouts of illness. One evening, Lieutenant Moss suffered from hallucinations due to a lack of sleep. So, as July approached, it became sandier and hotter. It got so hot that the metal from the bicycles gave some of the soldiers blisters and actually burned their hands. But as the men inched closer, because remember, they did not give up, they kept going. As they inched closer towards their destination, they began to actually be met with more resentment from local citizens. During one incident where they stopped for an evening, a local man refused to allow the soldiers to use his barn because he considered them Union soldiers. Yes, he was still harboring resentment from the Civil War. So you can probably imagine, they were tired and ready for this journey to end. They've been through mud, they've been through snow, blisters on their hands, um, sometimes resentment and hostility towards those who they encountered. But they kept going. But not all would finish because this mission ended early for one of the soldiers. It actually ended early for Private Eugene Jones because once the group reached Missouri, he asked to finish the remainder of the trip by rail because he didn't feel well. He felt sick. Um, but Lieutenant Moss, no, he wasn't having it. He actually didn't let him continue by rail. He actually sent him home by rail, all the way back to Fort Missoula. Lieutenant Moss described Private Eugene Jones. He accused him of killing morale. He thought that they would be better off without him, which would be interesting to further explore because he was so close to finishing this epic journey. So who knows what really happened with him? But I do think it was important to note that everyone that started, unfortunately, was not able to finish this journey. But for the rest, the end was in sight. And as they got closer, a group called the St. Louis Wheelmen would meet them to escort them the rest of the way. Unfortunately, along with the St. Louis Wheelmen came the rain and the mud. You know, that same rain and mud that they encountered on the first stretch of their journey, it also caught up with them on the last part, and that escorted them to their destination as well. So, sickness, broken bicycles, and poor weather conditions, it didn't stop the men. And 41 days later, at Forest Park, St. Louis, Missouri, on July 24th, 1897, their 1,900-mile journey was over. The men had traveled an average of 55 miles a day in harsh conditions, and their journey cost a total of a whopping $43. Now, thousands of local citizens, black and white, gathered to celebrate the men for completing this epic journey. It was a huge parade, it was a party. The soldiers wowed the crowd by completing drills on their bicycles during the celebration, still wearing the same tattered uniforms on their backs that they traveled with. Everyone was excited to see them. Everyone celebrated them. Everyone except for Not a single officer from the Army bothered to show, not one. But nevertheless, this journeys proved that cycling could be incorporated to effectively relay messages and transport troops at a cheaper rate, cheaper and faster actually than using horses. Now, Lieutenant Moss was extremely excited about this journey, and he was planning another trip to continue this research. However, his dreams were cut short when Battleship Men exploded in the Havana harbor. The 25th Infantry, the Buffalo Soldiers that embarked on this journey, they were one of the first chosen for battle. Black soldiers were thought better suited for battle in the tropical heat. It's another topic or another explore that at a later time. And with that, this experiment was done. Now, remember, I told you everyone celebrated them once they arrived, but the rest of the country, not so much. Um, yes, Mr. Edward Booth continued to write these stories and he wrote about this journey, but the discovery of gold actually kept the journey from the headlines. And it soon became something that was forgotten. Now, at the beginning of this podcast, or in the middle, when I began talking about this journey, I felt it was important to read each of the names of the soldiers because they're rarely named in documents or documentaries written about this topic. A lot of the participants, the actual soldiers who rode, they rarely spoke about their journey. And some of their family members didn't even realize that they participated in this epic journey because it was just something they didn't talk about. No one else talked about it. So I wanted to make sure to shine a spotlight on them for their heroic actions and the monumental contribution they made to the military and U.S. history. Now, when I thought about the strength of these soldiers and the strength they had to display to complete this journey, and I just thought about probably all of those lonely nights out there under the stars, sleeping under those conditions, wondering what was going to become of them or where this journey would lead them next. I knew the perfect wine to complement this episode. And this actually, I chose Nightjar, which is a wine that is served at Cooper's Hawk, which is a restaurant that also has a substantial wine selection. It's a wine restaurant, however you want to term that. But I thought Nightjar would be perfect for this episode. And I've actually had this wine a few times in the past, but now that I'm a little bit more knowledgeable, I'm not an expert, not at all, definitely a newbie in this field, but I'm a little more informed about wine tasting, and my most recent experience has definitely been a different experience from the previous times that I tasted this wine. So Nightjar, it's a dessert wine that actually has brandy that is added to it during the fermentation process. And like the Buffalo Soldiers, this wine has a dark tone to it and it is strong. It's a nice, strong wine. So when you smell this wine, and you know I'm all about the smells. So if you're new to wine tasting, definitely start, you know, give it a swirl to let the air hit and let those aromas come out and start smelling your wine. Enjoy that before you taste it. It will definitely open you up to a new and better experience. But as you smell this wine, you can really smell the chocolate in this wine. It's a rich wine and it's very low in tannin, so you won't get that mouth puckering substance usually found in red wines. But it does have a high alcohol content, so keep that in mind and slip so slow. Enjoy it. Initially, I tasted the chocolate, but towards the end, I was really able to taste the blueberries in this wine. And although blueberries, that was one of the last things I tasted, the taste of chocolate lingers. It definitely lingered in my mouth. So this is a full-bodied dessert wine, and it will be appreciated by someone who would like to try a nice dessert wine without trying something that is super sweet. So definitely, if you would like a fuller body dessert wine, you don't want something super sweet, try this. It definitely will pair well with um, chocolates. Really good. Like it just, oh my gosh, I felt like I was sucking on a nice little piece of chocolate there in my wine glass. Really nice wine to have after dinner. So, with that being said, I thank you joining me as I explore this epic journey of the Buffalo Soldiers. Full length episodes air every first and third Wednesdays here on Spotify and other streaming platforms. But if you can't wait to get your wine fix, no problem. I've got you. You can visit me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube for my quick down Wednesday shorts. Excuse me on that. Wind down Wednesday shorts. Look me up. I'm winding through time on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm winding through time two, the number two on YouTube. Make sure you like, follow, and subscribe. And definitely make sure that you're following me here, have your notifications on, so when these new episodes drop, you can get notified and you can tune in. So tune in for my next full-length episode. It's going to be a very special holiday edition, and I'll give you a hint. If you miss it, you might shoot your eye out. Thank you again.